Chapter 3 Islands in the Sky. Link opened the door to the oven, letting the smell of freshly baked bread waft out. Outside a snowstorm raged, but the inside of their home was warm and cozy, full of delicious smells, just as he liked. "Oh, that smells good," Zelda said. He looked up to see her peering down at him from the loft overhead. She was dressed in a thin white shirt, and her hair was the kind of messy tangle that only came about after a particularly good night's rest. He smiled warmly. "I was wondering when you'd wake up." "Oh, I've been awake for a while." She made her way down the stairs, stifling a yawn that made Link think she hadn't been awake for that long. "I was watching the snow for a bit. It's coming down fast." He kissed Zelda briefly when she reached him, before turning back to the open oven to inspect the bread. "I'm gonna have to dig us out when it's done." "Link, you must find me." "What?" He straightened and looked back at her, frowning. Zelda raised her brows. "I said I wondered if the Cryonis rune could somehow be used to clear away the snow." "Oh, I thought..." Link shook his head, smiling. "Never mind." He turned back to the oven. "And personally, I think the bomb rune would do the trick nicely. And scorch the side of our house in the process. It probably needs to be repainted this year anyway." He used a wide spatula to scoop up the bread and pull it free from the oven, satisfied by the golden brown coloring of the crust. "Link, you must find me." Zelda's voice right in his ear made him jump with a start, causing the bread to bounce off the spatula and onto the floor. "Zelda, what?" He looked back at her. Only she wasn't there any longer. There was no one behind him at all. "Zelda?" He looked around, confused. "Where did you go?" Their front door was open and a frigid wind blew in, howling through the rafters and snuffing out the lamps. Outside was pitch black. The storm still raged, yet it was still so dark that Link couldn't see the snow falling. "Zelda?" His voice quivered some as he stepped towards the door. His heart began to race as again she failed to respond. "Zelda?" As he approached the door, a blast of icy wind hit him, pushing him back. He crashed into a chair, and they both toppled to the floor in a heap. He heard dishes being blown off the table, and something heavy crashed to the ground hard enough to cause the ground to tremble. Link groaned, lifting his head and looked towards the door. There, just on the other side of the threshold, mostly obscured by darkness, stood a skeletal figure with long red hair and orange glowing eyes. The creature laughed, and Link screamed as his arm burned away to nothing. "Zelda, no!" Link jerked awake, body going rigid before his head came back down, striking painfully on the stone. Stars burst before his eyes, and he cried out in pain and shock. He reached back, rubbing the back of his head with a groan before pushing himself up into a seated position. He was sitting on the floor in a dark room. The floor was stone, but around him, on all sides and above, what looked like thick tree roots. The barest glimmers of light filtered down from above, through the roots. That's right. I'm underground with Zelda, and except that he could now see stone walls behind some of those tree roots. There hadn't been roots earlier, had there? His memory was fuzzy. They'd used the passage underneath Lookout Landing, an old tunnel that had existed to get the royal family out of danger, in case of an attack. To this day, Link still wondered if Zelda's father, King Rohan Bosphoramos, had managed to escape Hyrule Castle when the calamity appeared, only to die in battle later. Or if he had been among the first killed. We went down into the lowest basements of the castle, and then found a tunnel. Getting the Don in after them had been challenging. They ultimately used one of Purr's travel medallions to teleport the Don in once they found the cavern system that led down beneath the castle, and it became clear that it would not be a quick trip. It all came rushing back. Their expedition, the Zonai structures, the corpse, Zelda falling, Zelda disappearing into darkness. Zelda. A low moan bubbled up from Link's core as he replayed the images of that moment over and over in his mind. Zelda's fearful eyes and the way she'd met his. He'd seen surprise in her eyes as she fell. Surprise and terror. Their fingertips had brushed. Why hadn't he stretched just a little further? Why hadn't he moved a little faster? No. He felt sick. His stomach writhed in horror at the memory. And he reached up, covering his face. No. No, Hylia. It can't. I need to... He remembered the brief flash of light he thought he'd seen as she fell. Dare he hope that she'd discover her powers in that dire moment? That's how it had been during the calamity, after all. They didn't surface until Zelda had stared death in the face. He clung to that thread of hope, like it was the lifeline keeping him from careening over the edge of a cliff himself. He hadn't imagined that light, and the light must have meant something. She'd regained her power there, in her moment of desperation, but where was she? And where was he? His thoughts were still confused, but he could remember the hand grabbing him, stopping him from following Zelda into the abyss. She got her powers back, he reminded himself, determinedly not considering any alternatives. The hand grabbed me and brought me here? He looked around again, taking more note of his surroundings. He could see the remnants of stone walls behind the tree roots. Wherever this was, it was an old underground structure that nature had decided to reclaim for itself. Vines hung down in several places, and there were places on the ground where weeds and other plants had broken through the stone bricks. It didn't look anything like the chamber he and Zelda had found the living corpse in. The one that attacked me with malice, he recalled grimly. And only then did he think to look at his left hand. The last time he'd seen it, it had been scorched and blackened by the malice, or gloom, whatever it was called. It hadn't just been burned, though. It had been emaciated, as if all his muscle had been eaten away with the sleeve of his tunic. That wasn't how it looked now. He inhaled sharply, eyes wide in shock and bewilderment, as he took in his arm's appearance. His entire arm, from just above the elbow to the tips of his fingers, was a dark gray color, with a tinge of green. It wasn't blackened or scorched, as had been the case earlier, and instead the skin appeared whole, albeit different. It was covered with an intricate coppery-colored bracer that wrapped around his forearm in an odd lattice of geometric lines and right angles, leaving as much of his arm exposed as was covered. The bracer extended up to the back of his hand. Even this was no longer recognizable as his. Besides the color, the hand at the tip of the arm had longer, thinner fingers than his own, and each ended in a sharp, pointed nail that very well could have been claws. Each finger was almost bony, with its knuckles standing out starkly. Each was adorned with a ring of various sizes, all made of the same coppery metal. Link's eyes traveled up his arm in the other direction, up to his shoulder, where he finally started seeing the pale tan of his natural skin color. But, even here, things had changed. The gray skin continued in a similar pattern to the bracer, up his bicep and shoulder, and even onto the left side of his chest. It looked almost like a tattoo, and Link found himself wondering if he'd somehow fallen victim to a prank. Could someone have applied a tattoo to him while he was out? For several seconds he couldn't do anything but examine his hand. He could feel it. When he clenched it into a fist, the nails felt sharp, and he was certain that he could pierce his own palm if he kept squeezing. Beyond that, the arm ached. It was a phantom sort of pain, reminiscent of the burning sensation he'd felt in that underground chamber, and he hadn't felt it until he noticed the arm. The pain ebbed and flowed, and he grasped his shoulder, where the new arm had seemingly been, fused to his body, with his right and still normal hand. Here, especially hurt. It felt like 1,000 stabbing needles. He winced and clenched his jaw as the pain throbbed throughout his replacement arm. But Link was no stranger to pain, and he endured it with deep, steady breaths until the pain subsided. Only then did he acknowledge that he had seen this arm before. The arm that had seemingly been grafted onto Link was the exact same arm that had been with the living corpse underground. Then it had glowed with an ethereal green light, true, but this was undoubtedly the same one. He recognized it as the hand that had grabbed him as he fell. "Ah, Link, good. I see you're awake." As he heard the voice behind him, the arm pulsed with a soft green light. He gasped and leapt to his feet, spinning around. As he did so, he reached back to draw his sword, but his hand found only empty air. Unwilling to consider the implications of that for the time being, he focused, instead, on the very tall figure in front of him, who also happened to be dead, if his transparency and pale blue glow were any indication. Link had encountered spirits and ghosts before, but this spirit was quite unlike any that he'd seen before. For one, this spirit was a creature that Link only knew from his expedition underground with Zelda. Though the statues they'd seen had been stylized and artistically crafted, the similarity between the statues and the person standing before him was undeniable. He was looking at the ghost of Zonai. Zonai raised his hands, palm forward in a gesture of peace. "Oh, I'm sorry. I did not intend to startle you." He chuckled softly to himself. "Though I suppose turning around to find a spirit would be shocking for anyone." Link opened his mouth and licked his lips before clearing his throat. Even so, when he spoke, his voice sounded hoarse and dry, and he wondered how long he had been unconscious. "That's not nearly so shocking for me as you think. Still, forgive me for appearing to you in this manner. This is unfortunately all that is left of me." The man's lips pulled back into a bit of a wolfish smile before he continued. "You are Link, are you not?" Link nodded, trying to size up the ghostly Zonai floating a few inches off the ground in front of him. He was tall, at least head and shoulders taller than Link, though not quite as tall as a full-grown Zora, perhaps about as tall as a typical Gerudo. His body was not unlike a Hylian's, or the other races of Hyrule, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but his torso seemed elongated when compared to his relatively shorter legs. That, however, was where the similarities truly ended. The Zonai had a distinct snout with a long, flat nose and a protruding mouth, a pair of large eyes where one might expect, and what looked like a third eye in the center of his forehead, though this one remained closed. He had enormous pointed ears that each extended out from his head, parallel to the ground, and 4 stubby horns stuck out of his forehead. He had a long mane of thick, white hair that began at his scalp, covering his ears like fur, and extended all the way down his back to his feet. "I know you must have some questions," said the Zonai. "First, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Rauru. I am the one who brought you here." Link's eyes fell back to Rauru's hand, and another piece of the puzzle fell into place. "This is your arm, isn't it?" he said, looking down at his new arm. As he did so, he felt that same throb of pain as before, like something writhing under his skin. Rauru inclined his head, his expression grave. "Yes. Your wounds were severe. I did what I could to purify your body and encourage your recovery, but your arm was beyond any hope of saving." The spirit held up his own left hand, and Link noticed that this had a brighter glow to it than the other hand, as if even his spirit recognized the loss of his own hand. "But why? Why replace it? Why give me yours?" Rauru met Link's eyes again. "If I had not removed your arm, the wound would have festered, and the infection would have spread. I managed to isolate much of Ganondorf's power in your damaged arm, but not all of it. The arm you have now should still have some of my power, and it can keep his dark power at bay, and prevent it from spreading further." Rauru paused before saying, And besides, I think you have much greater need of it than I do now, after all. He motioned at his spiritual form. Zelda has told me much about you, and Zelda? You've seen her? Link whirled, looking around wildly, heart racing like a drum in his chest. He had intended to ask about the one Rauru named Ganondorf, but that was driven from his mind in a heartbeat. Was Zelda here? His lips parted in a grin as he waited to see her walk around one of those tree roots, whole and well. He didn't think he had ever felt so relieved as that moment. Link, there is much to tell you. Rauru's voice sounded grim, and the relief Link felt diminished. Where is she? Where's my wife? I do not know, Rauru said, ears drooping slightly. When I met her, Link, I met her aeons ago, long before your time. My wife, Sonia, understood her plight much greater than I, but as I understand it, when you encountered Ganondorf beneath Hyrule, Zelda somehow managed to transport herself back through time to my Hyrule. Link struggled to understand. Sonia, Ganondorf, his Hyrule? But he seized on the last thing Rauru said. She'd traveled through time, into the past. Zonai nodded. Yes, I do not know how far back exactly that is, but she made it sound as though it was long, long ago. Link's mind spun with this revelation. Zelda had survived the fall, which comforted him, but everything else... But where is she now, and how? How did she end up in your time? That is a long story, and I'm not sure how much time I have left in this world. He raised his hand when Link opened his mouth to speak. But I will tell you what I can. Come, however, let us leave this place. I have had no opportunity to see the sun since sealing Ganondorf, and I will not pass from this world to the next without seeing it once more. Link nodded, and he turned to follow Rauru as the Zonai passed around a large tree root, and through some vines into what appeared to be a more open room. But before he could follow, his eyes fell on a glint of metal in the shade of one of the roots. Oh no. He hurried forward, crouching on the ground to see it close up. There on the ground lay what remained of the Master Sword. The blade was broken. Not only broken, but it looked to have been melted and eaten away. It was less than half as long as it once was, now ending in a mangled, distorted mess. Shriveled and blackened, not unlike Link's damaged arm had been. Only nearest the hilt was the metal still intact, along with the hilt itself. It was that silvery metal that had been seen beneath the root. With a trembling hand, Link reached out, wrapping his fingers around the hilts and lifting the Master Sword. He stood looking down at the sword in sorrow. He couldn't feel the spirit of the sword in his mind. The Master Sword appeared to be nothing more than a broken sword. A dead sword. Rauru floated closer to Link, examining the sword. Zelda once spoke to me of the Master Sword. She said it had been damaged in your encounter with Ganondorf. Is that it then? Link nodded solemnly. He tried to quest out with his mind, seeking the connection that he'd always had with the sword, with her. He felt nothing in return. A lump formed in Link's throat and he closed his eyes tightly. I don't have time to feel this right now, he told himself, walling off the part of him that mourned the loss. He didn't dare consider the implications if the Master Sword was truly gone for good. He opened his eyes, turning his gaze to Rauru again. You were going to tell me about Zelda. Rauru nodded, and passed through some stiff vines that Link had to push out of his way. It is as I said. Zelda traveled back in time to my age. I am a Zonai, and in my time, I was only one of two. The rest of my people were lost. He grew quiet for several seconds. The rest of my people are lost. Link didn't know what to say. What could you say when speaking to the last ghost of a forgotten people? After a short silence, Rauru continued, his voice growing firm. I knew I was the last long ago. But that doesn't matter now. In my time, Zelda came to me confused and seeking help on how to return to you. She feared you were in further danger after she fell. He looked back at Link, smiling. Little did I know then that I would eventually be the one to save you. Link couldn't bring himself to smile, for he didn't feel saved at all. His arm was gone, and his replacement felt wrong. He kept poking his palms with his nails. Furthermore, now that he was upright and walking, he already felt fatigued. His muscles protested even the simple act of walking, and he felt the beginnings of a headache in his forehead and behind his eyes. And he still didn't know where Zelda was. Link, I have something I want you to try. Rauru said ahead of him, past another lattice of thick vines that Link had to force out of his path. On the other side, he emerged from the overgrown tree roots and vines to discover a large open room. After what he'd seen underground, Link immediately understood the room to be Zonai in design. Everything from the way the square support pillars were thicker near the ceiling and thinner near the ground, to the Zonai text carved into several of the stones, to even the choice of stone itself. One wall was largely covered by a large wheel, made Link think of the water wheels one might see in a river, or the wheels that made up some of the inner workings of the divine beasts. It sat inert, however, and he couldn't see where any of the water might fall in it. The other wall was devoid of this wheel device, but that was because the wheel had fallen off and lay on its side on the ground. In the middle of the room was some kind of statue. It looked like a pair of long dragons rising from the floor and curving to form a circle large enough for him to walk through. Zonai text was etched along this, too. It looked like an archway, though it stood alone in the open. Rauru floated by this statue, waiting. As Link approached, suddenly a green image appeared in midair, within the circle. It glowed, giving off a pale green light, and consisted of a doubling of Zonai's script, along with several other symbols that Link couldn't hope to understand. But in the center of the circle was a big stylized eye, and beneath the eye was the unmistakable design of a hand with long, thin fingers and thick knuckles. Link looked down at his left hand, comparing it to the image floating in the air in front of him. Then he looked at Rauru. What do you want me to do? Rauru nodded at the image. Touch it with your hand. Link did so, reaching up with his Zonai hand and placing it against the projected image. He half expected to touch something solid, but his hand easily passed through the green projection. However, as he did so, his hand pulsed with light, and the image followed suit, the pulse beginning where he touched and spreading out. As the pulse of light spread, the image broke apart, as if shattered into pieces, each piece fading away moments later. Excellent. I had hoped you would be able to interface with Zonai technology. And if you have that, then perhaps. Rauru reached up to stroke the underside of his jaw. Link frowned at him. What do you mean? What was that? He got his answer a moment later, however, as a door on the other side of the chamber that he hadn't noticed before began to part from the middle. Each half of the door slid open sideways, and as the door opened, he caught sight of a bright light at the end of a short tunnel. Sunlight. Link didn't wait before rushing forward, feeling a sudden overwhelming need to get out of there. How long had he been underground? Weeks? Months? It had been impossible to tell, and both he and Zelda had largely given up trying to keep track of the passage of time after a while. Ah, Link! He ignored Rauru's voice, hurrying out the door and down the hallway, that bright spot of light growing in size and intensity as he approached. Despite the situation, Link found himself smiling, breathing deeply of the fresh air flowing into the hallway from the opening. How long had it been since he was able to smell the outdoors? The light was blinding after being in the dark for so long, but he didn't care. He hurried forward into the brilliance. shading his eyes with his hand and relishing the sudden burst of warmth he felt upon his skin. "Link, be careful." Rauru's warning came just in time. The light was so bright that Link nearly failed to see the cliff's edge in front of him. He stopped, barely, his toes protruding over the edge. What he saw stunned him far more than anything else he'd seen that day. He saw clouds, a distant horizon, and he saw mountain peaks that seemed almost level with him. Link stood on an island, floating in midair, amid a group of other flying islands, and the islands were flying far, far above the land of Hyrule, which he could make out through breaks in the clouds. The clouds beneath him. What in Hylian's name is this? Link backed away from the edge and spun to face Rauru, eyes wide in alarm. How are we flying? The Zonai approached, floating up to the edge and looking down thoughtfully. I haven't quite figured that out myself. What do you mean you haven't figured this out? This whole place is Zonai made, isn't it? Rauru nodded. Oh, yes. I recognize it from my time. Do you see that building down there? He pointed to a large island some hundreds of feet below them, and it still was hundreds, if not thousands of feet over Hyrule's surface. At one end of the island was a massive building in a style that he'd never seen before. That building is called the Temple of Time, and it was considered a holy place in my era. The structure was tiered, but in reverse, with the smallest tier at the bottom, with each successive tier, of which there were 4 in total, growing larger in turn, like an inverted pyramid. The building was rectangular, and the shorter walls curved out slightly, while the longer sides bowed inward. Is that concave or convex? He wondered. Zelda would know. Finally, the building itself seemed to hang out over the edge of the floating island, somehow staying aloft despite its only support being a thin, mostly broken bridge leading to it. The Temple of Time? He asked, looking at Rauru, frowning. Yes, I believe Zelda said you have one too. Each time he casually mentioned speaking to Zelda sent a jolt of an uneasy jumble of emotions through Link. It sparked both hope and concern. He hadn't finished his story yet, after all. Yes, but it doesn't look like that. Link stepped closer to the edge of the flying island, looking down with trepidation. He wasn't afraid of heights, but this... I don't understand. How are we flying right now? Refined Zonite, I would assume. I'm really not very knowledgeable on the matter, though. That was more Mineru's area of expertise. Rauru continued to stroke his chin. What I am most curious about is why these buildings and the islands are flying. Why they are flying? In my time, these were all on the ground, Link. Rauru looked at him. This was the ground. For some reason, entire sections of the ground were ripped up and placed in the sky. And you don't know why. I have been in that chamber with Ganondorf since we fought him in my time. When I brought you up here, I will admit that I was not thinking straight. It had been so long since I'd had any freedom to move or even think, that I moved by my instinct more than anything. I could faintly sense the remnants of Zonai power in the skies, and so I brought you here. Rauru considered the view before them. I did not inspect this place closely as we flew up. My chief concern was getting you to a safe place and stabilizing you. I did not even realize that we were near the Temple of Time, but perhaps that was what I sensed all along. Link looked down again, and a new thought occurred to him. How do we get down? That is another question that I've been considering, Rauru said, turning his attention back to Link. And I have an idea that should work, now that I'm certain your arms still hold some of my power. What do you mean by that, your power? I will explain, but not until we've gotten off this island. Rauru floated closer to Link, looking down at Link's Zonai arm. As Rauru approached, the arm responded, glowing with an inner ethereal light. Yes, I can still feel it, though my connection to it has grown weak. Rauru? Link, you must trust me now. I believe that with your arm you may be able to access certain abilities that we Zonai were capable of. Rauru stretched out his spectral hand, leaving it hovering just above Link's own hand, which was also extended. Link couldn't remember stretching out his hand like that, though. Had it moved on its own accord? Had Rauru moved it? Thought power, We could build magnificent structures and devices in mere minutes. We could lift boulders with a mere thought, and we could even pass through solid objects as if they were water. Link watched perplexed as Rauru lowered his ghostly hand into Link's hand. As he did so, Link's hand pulsed brightly, and suddenly the Zonai was gone. But he wasn't gone. Though his ghostly form had vanished, Link could still feel him within his head. We do not have time to explain right now, Rauru said, still standing as though he were right beside Link, despite no longer having a form he could see. I fear that if I remain attached to your arm, it may ultimately reject your body, but the longer I stay apart from it, the fainter my connection it grows. Reject my body, Link thought, deciding right away that he didn't like the way that sounded. Okay, what do I need to do? Jump off. Excuse me? Link, you must listen to me. Rauru's voice had grown sharper, and as he spoke, Link noticed a new burning sensation in his shoulder. The feeling radiated out from where the Zonai arm had been grafted onto him. I know that it makes no sense to you now, but I assure you that you will be quite safe, as long as you do not fight me on this. Link stepped up to the edge of the Sky Island, looking down and taking a deep breath. So you just want me to jump? Yes, jump, Link, fall, you will not be harmed. Link was no stranger to risk-taking. He was an avid rock climber, usually with nothing but his own bare hands and feet to keep him from falling dozens of feet. He didn't know how many bones he'd broken over the years, and it was probably a miracle that he could even still walk. And all of that was before one considered his combat experience and triumphs. He'd fought monsters that towered over him, creatures of pure power and malice, and came out on top each time. As much, he knew he would do what Rauru said. Even though he feared it might be suicide, he would do so. He had never gotten anywhere in his life without taking a leap, after all. This was no different. I sure wish I had a paraglider right about now, he thought, smiling wryly. Hope you're ready to catch me, Rauru. Link leaped. Immediately, his stomach ended up somewhere in the region of his mouth. Spread himself out, arms and legs outstretched, falling face down towards the island far below. There were patchy clouds between him and it, though, and he watched with amazement as he fell towards one of them. What do I do? He called out into the air. He could barely hear his own voice, but Rauru appeared to be able to hear him just fine, and when the Zonai spoke, Link too could hear him over the noise. For now, just enjoy the view. This was always one of my favorite things to do. Link shut his mouth, and had to squint his eyes against the wind he felt in his face. He wished he had some of the goggles he occasionally wore when seal surfing out in the Gerudo Desert. The air was cold too, and it grew only colder, and wetter, as he passed into and out the other side of a puffy white cloud. But passing through the cloud gave him a view that was breathtaking. The pain in his arm was forgotten. The way his eyes stung was unimportant. Even the fact that he was falling through the sky was pushed to the recesses of his mind. He could see everything. Link had stood atop Death Mountain, Heber Peak, and Mount Lanayru, and none of those heights had ever given him such an incredible view of the world. He was high enough that he felt he could see from one end of Hyrule to the other. He could see Death Mountain, smoky haze rising from its mouth, and Zora's Domain. There were the dueling peaks far below in the Great Plateau, Mount Lanayru, the Gerudo Highlands, and even distant to Bantha. And he even saw that this set of islands wasn't alone in the sky. He could see dozens of floating islands all around them. They were sparsely spread out in all directions, some large and others small. Some islands were solitary, individual pinpricks in the distant sky, while others were part of island chains extending thousands of feet into the air. Where'd they all come from? He passed another floating island and he saw his own shadow briefly flash across its rocky surface. And finally, he broke. His lips pulled into a grin, and he began to laugh. He was still terrified, yes, but in that moment, he didn't let himself feel it. That moment felt the same as the first time he'd stepped off and flown with the paraglider. Or like the first time he'd galloped Epona across an open field. He wasn't falling, he was flying. By changing the positions of his hands, he could make himself turn in the air. He could speed his fall by going into a dive. He could even control the direction of his descent, he found, by angling his body. Distantly, Link heard a roar, and he looked around, seeing a dragon below him. It weaved through the air like an eel near the Temple of Time. The dragon's body was long and sinuous, like a serpent, but with 4 thin legs that moved as if propelling the dragon forward through the air. Its white scales shimmered in the light, and blue crystalline spines protruded along its back. Its tail grew thicker, with more of the spines growing along its sides, making it look quite dangerous. The dragon's head was long and narrow, with a beak-like snout. It had brilliant blue horns reminiscent of a deer's antlers, and behind its head was a mane of golden hair. Link realized with a start that he'd never seen this dragon. At first glance, he thought it to be Naedra, thanks to its similar coloring, but Naedra's snout and horns were completely different than this one. Nor was it Dinral or Farosh. This dragon was new. Had it hidden among the clouds just like these islands seemingly had. "Link!" Rauru's voice rang out in his head, drawing Link's attention back to the present. He was startled to see the ground was rising up very fast now. "What do I do?" "Dive, with your left hand outstretched." "What?" "Do it, Link, now!" Link did so. He angled his body in a dive, realizing that there was a body of water directly below him. Surely, Rauru didn't think he could just dive into the water and be unscathed. He was no cliff diver, but he'd heard of people attempting dives off of cliffs, thinking to use the water to soften their fall. The water broke their bones instead, and took their lives nearly as often. Those cliffs were quite a bit lower than the Sky Island he'd just jumped off of so recklessly. The water rushed up to meet him, and Link forced himself to keep his eyes open. He stretched his Zonai hand out, and he saw now that it was glowing a brilliant blue-green, far brighter than it had before. It looked just as bright as it had in the dark cavern despite the bright sunlight. His hand opened, palm out towards the ground, and Link realized that he hadn't done that. Rauru had, seemingly taken control of his hand. And as he approached the flat surface of the water below, close enough now to make out big lily pads and water grasses, he felt a change. Link's hand pulsed with an unfamiliar sensation, but it spread throughout his body. It felt, at once, like he'd passed into a pool of cool water, but without the sensation of being wet. And he realized that he no longer felt the wind blowing against him, and even the sound of it had greatly diminished. He felt lighter. Then he struck the surface of the water. Except, he didn't. Link passed through the water, but felt none of it, nor did it slow his descent at all, as if it were all an illusion. Through the hazy water he could see the lake bed rapidly approaching, and he began to prepare himself for impact. He released the broken Master Sword from his right hand, and tried to pull his left arm back, but heard Rauru suddenly cry, "No!" in his head. He relinquished control of his arm again, and passed into the ground under the lake. At once everything went black. Darkness was all around, and Link couldn't breathe. But he could still feel his Zonai arm as it angled up, and Link thought he felt his descent slow, and then stop. However, he was still in the dark. He was still in the ground. He felt the first fingers of panic taking over him. He was underground. No, he was in the ground. He'd somehow passed through a solid surface and was now buried. Hylia knew how far underground. Could he dig his way out? He couldn't tell if he was surrounded by dirt or stone. "Link," Rauru's voice in his ear again. "Link, listen to me. You're all right, but I need you to swim." Swim? What does he mean? I'm in the ground. "Link, trust me, with my power you can pass through solid objects, but it's more than that. You can move through them. I've always viewed it like swimming. And that has worked for me. Pretend you're in a pool of water and swim." Link closed his eyes, but that made no difference. He couldn't see anything anyway. His lungs burned, but when he tried to breathe, there was nothing to fill his lungs. He feared he would die here, having survived this fall, but killed by strange Zonai magic. He began to swim. He kicked his legs and reached out with his right arm. And as he did so, he felt some resistance. Not anything solid, yet it did feel like he was swimming through water suddenly. He propelled himself, trusting his outstretched left hand to know the direction he needed to go. "That's it. Keep going." You're almost there. He pushed himself, somehow kicking off of solid stone to propel himself faster, and soon began to pull himself with both hands, hoping he was heading in the right direction. His lungs screamed for air and his thoughts grew increasingly panicked, but he swam, through stone, through dirt, and then water. He resisted the urge to breathe when he suddenly saw the shimmering light of the sun above him, through the water. He'd passed back out of the ground and into the pool of water that he dove into. Lungs straining, he swam the last 10 feet, 20 feet, and finally, his head broke the surface. Link gasped sharply, his long hair covering his face, blinding him again as he gulped down the sweet, fresh air. He filled his lung twice, 3 times, 4 times before he finally reached up and brushed the hair from his face. He was surprised to see Rauru floating just above the surface of the water in front of him, smiling broadly, no longer within the arm. "Excellent," he said. "I worried that wouldn't work."